Well, hello, thank you so much for the chance to join you. Happy Pride, and thanks for all of the work that everyone here is doing to make sure that we bring the change that we need. I'll be very brief because I'm really looking forward to the chance to dig in for Q&A and really to talk about whatever's on your mind. But I just want to say to college Democrats across the country, I know that you are being robbed in a lot of ways of the kind of on-campus, in-person experiences, whether as an intern or in the summer or as a student and everything in between that usually characterize college life. And it's not fair, it's not your fault, and you're dealing with it. The other side of that coin is that you're coming of age in a moment of unbelievable consequence. All the moments that we look back on in history with fascination and that we consider romantic in their upheaval and their importance, they're actually pretty tough to live through at the time. I'm pretty sure this is true of the 60s, as romanticized as they are today. I'm sure it was true of the time that gave rise to the New Deal. Any of the moments that deserve their place in history deserve that place because it's so tough to get through. And those are the kinds of moments when really important decisions and changes happen. And so the fact that you are where you are, that you are who you are, that is to say politically active, college students, strong in your values, actually is a huge opportunity to shape the course of this country. Add to that the fact that the 2020s, the decade that is beginning right now, are on course to be among the most consequential ever, just by the way that they sit in history. I mean, I already thought that was true with President Trump. Then the COVID pandemic and the outpouring of anguish across the country over systemic racism in recent weeks. And we're only halfway through this year. Tells you that we're just at one of those absolutely critical moments. And then because of other clocks that have nothing to do with politics or history, but just science, especially the climate clock, which is basically telling us that we have the next 10 years to take massive action on climate change or it'll be too late. Means that basically how the next decade goes will decide how the rest of our lifetimes will go. And so with the pressure that comes with that also comes a huge chance to make change. And that's especially true in the issues that we concern ourselves with as Democrats, like racial justice. This has to become a country that demonstrates through action its recognition that Black lives matter. And ultimately, there has to be a fusion of the advocacy and the activism that's happening on the streets to the outcomes of elections. And not just the elections that are getting all the attention, the presidential election, which of course I'm enthusiastically involved with, but also making sure that we have more justice-minded and progressive DAs and attorneys general and others with their hands on real machinery of the justice system, and recognizing that this is about a lot more than police accountability, though that must come, and the justice system, though that must be reformed. This is also about making sure that we actually see the kind of economic empowerment and equality and the health equity and the basic democratic equality that to this day has not been achieved despite everything that happened, all the progress that was made from the first, what Reverend Barber calls the first Reconstruction after the Civil War, through the second Reconstruction that was the Civil Rights Movement, to the one we're living in now. Look no further than the patterns of voter suppression that have happened in places like Georgia. So we're at the moment of this perfect storm where the issues that we care about are coming to a head, and the decisions that we're making right now that are about to be made by the people who are about to be elected are going to shape the terms of our political and social and economic futures for the rest of our lives. Getting out of the pandemic, right? If you believe, as I am passionately convinced of, that going back to whatever we were doing before is not just impossible, but it's also undesirable, that means the question of how we're going to come out of this pandemic is nothing less than the question of what our political and social and economic institutions are going to be. And again, this rhymes with various moments in history that were pretty tough at the time. Think of what FDR was confronted with when the New Deal began. The New Deal didn't start as a campaign promise that he got elected, came in, went in, and then did just as he thought it up. It was dealing with the circumstances that required a new way of thinking. And that's what we're in right now. And that's where you come in. Now, elections, especially presidential elections, have gone through a lot of change over the years. Right, 100 years ago, it was considered kind of rude to campaign for yourself. why people like William McKinley did their entire presidential campaign from their front porch. If you actually want to see the candidates speak, you have to go to them. These things change over time, but they've never had to change this quickly. But if you really think about it, I would argue candidates are basically doing the same thing, right? I mean, if you think about Joe Biden, even if he has to do it from home, or other candidates that we care about, what are they doing all day? They're engaging on policy, they're talking to media, they're raising money, they're rallying supporters, they're doing the same thing. They just have to do it from home. I think the real question is, those of us who are not on the ballot but are supporting those candidates, can we figure out how to do what we do in new ways, in the Zoomosphere or through social media, or even just with a good old-fashioned phone call to somebody who might listen to us if we help motivate them to run, which is the whole idea of relational organizing, which is part of what powered my campaign. It's really on us, and it's going to be harder, because one of the things, especially if you're like me and it's maybe not an instinct built into your personality to go pick up the phone and talk to strangers or knock on doors and pester people at their homes and ask them to vote for your candidate, if you draw energy and encouragement and excitement from being in a campaign office where you got to volunteer to your right and volunteer to your left, and they're doing the same thing, the smell of coffee in the coffee machine kind of gets you going, or you're doing that as a campus group mobilizing to go knock on doors together, that's harder, right? Because we're in so many ways prevented from doing it physically together. So it's going to fall to us to figure out new ways to supply not just the mechanics of it. Campaigns actually have that figured out. They can get you a virtual call packet right now. They can give you a social media toolkit right now. What we got to do is figure out how to get the social glue that makes us understand we're part of a community of supporters, as well as just separate people who happen to believe that the same candidate ought to get elected. That's what it's up to us to figure out ways to do. I've got a few ideas on that, but I bet you're way ahead of me. And so, again, I didn't want to have too much of an opening monologue, because I'm really excited to hear what you're seeing, as well as take up whatever questions are on your mind. I'm going to close that door because Chasten's arriving and the dogs are about to get agitated. And again, thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Bear with me. So thanks, see you later.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pete. We'll now move into student questions.
Great.
Good evening, Mayor Pete. My name is Juan Carlos Mora. My question is, last week the Supreme Court ruled that no LGBTQ plus American can be fired because of who they are or who they love. What was your reaction to this, and does this give you hope that we are starting to head in the right direction?
It does give me hope, and my reaction was that I was thrilled, and thrilled partly because I was worried about the alternative. And also because of the fact that it was not just the so-called liberal justices, but some, not all, some Republican appointees who decided that way too. And it's a reminder that what we're calling for, while it certainly falls to Democrats right now to argue for it, this is not a liberal agenda. It's not a gay agenda. It's something that most Americans believe. Matter of fact, the real problem you're up against, right, is that most Americans thought it was already true. And most Americans didn't know that it's totally legal to discriminate in a lot of places, including here in Indiana. When the sun came up a week ago today, perfectly legal. Not here in South Bend, because when I was mayor, we passed an ordinance about that, but in a lot of parts of the state, in a lot of parts of the country. So yes, it gives me hope. Yes, it's good news. Now, the other side of the coin is, as is the case with marriage equality, right? We can't let our guard down. Right? The president is still conducting a war against trans Americans. They're defining trans Americans out of existence. If you look at this Health and Human Services guidance that came out, there's still an epidemic of violence against Black trans women in particular. Conversion therapy is still out there, and we should find a new name for it, because whatever it is, it's not therapy, right? It's harming young people. And sometimes equal legal rights don't amount to equal social rights or social status. So we know we got a long way to go. But what a great bit of news to get in the middle of Pride and in the middle of such a challenging time around the country. So I'm thrilled. We're coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the decision that brought marriage equality to the land too, that let me marry Chasten and change so many lives. Things are moving. We just got to make sure that we keep that movement in the same direction, and that we speed it up a little bit. Next.
Hi, Mayor Pete. I'm Caroline. I was the national campus lead on your campaign. And in honor of Pride Month, I was wondering if you have any book recommendations by queer authors for all of us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your leadership of our organizing efforts, and thanks for everything that you brought to our team. And yeah, it's a good time to be reading. And my Pride reading list includes some new books that have just come out. But the biggest one I would start with is James Baldwin. A lot of reasons to be reading Baldwin right now. The Fire Next Time, it read one way to me when I read it in college, another way when I returned to it during the campaign, and a lot of people are rediscovering Baldwin. But you know, he was such an extraordinary American voice, an extraordinary Black voice, and an extraordinary queer voice. In the novel Giovanni's Room, which is written from a very different perspective than a lot of his other books, is I think well worth the read at a time like this. There's an extraordinary, you know, one of the great things about running was people would share books with me. There's a new one out called The Deviance War, which is about really a history of what it took early on to battle discrimination against federal employees, among other things. A great book by Andrew Reynolds on, I happen to have it here, it's called The Children of Harvey Milk. It's basically about the history of people who, in that tradition, campaigned as out candidates, and the difference that that made. This one didn't get as much attention, but I think it should. It's called Tinderbox, and it's about an incident that I didn't even know about. In the same way that I'm embarrassed that I was not taught the Orangeburg massacre of Black students at South Carolina State University, even though I was taught about Kent State. In all the history about Pride and Stonewall, I had not heard about what happened at the Upstairs Lounge in New Orleans, where a fire in the 1970s killed more than 30 people, and the response to it really revealed a lot about how queer people were treated at that time. So there's a history about it called Tinderbox, which I think is well worth the read. And I'd love to hear recommendations. Maybe people can pop in the chat and send it later, but I'm always on the lookout for new readings by myself, so I hope you'll share what's good and what's out there. And thanks for the question.
Hi, Mayor Pete. My name is Rose Lange-Meso, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Deputy here at CDA in the Membership Department. You recently tweeted that until Black Americans have the full economic, political, and social empowerment and equality that white citizens take for granted, that America will not be whole. Right now, white Americans need to learn what is required of us to make that a reality and act. What are you doing during this time to educate yourself and become a better ally?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work. And first of all, it is that part about educating, right? So reading Black authors, also reading about whiteness. And this is, I think, a challenging thing for well-intentioned white people to really think about. Because, look, I think for most of our lives, most of the times we've encountered white people who are really thinking or talking a lot about being white. It's the worst kind of white nationalists, right? But if we're all over, hopefully most of us are over the fiction that we don't see color or that race doesn't shape our lives, then white people need to think about what it means to be white. And in order to be anti-racist, and in order to be attuned to the Black experience, and in order to come to grips with our privilege, not from the framework of guilt, but from the framework of how it can then be used to mobilize around change, we've got a lot of work to do. And so again, I feel like I'm doing a book club here. They got me in my study, and it's literally at the top of my pile on my desk. But this book, White Fragility, is getting a lot of attention. Very rigorously done. Very, I think, helpful starting point, especially if you find yourself having conversations with, I don't know, relatives who maybe don't understand why you don't think all lives matter, and you have to explain why. You know, it's that you know, no one thinks all lives don't matter. It's just that not everybody has to start a hashtag to assert that theirs do, and that's why it's so important to say Black Lives Matter. You know, these conversations that I think a lot of us find we're having intergenerationally too. So I'm trying to educate myself and kind of become more attuned to the ways in which my day-to-day experience is shaped by race, because part of being white in a society where whiteness is the default is that you don't have to think about it in the way that people of color and certainly Black people have to be reminded of their race at every turn. That in turn is why it's so important to be reading Black authors right now. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, for example, is of course deservedly getting a lot of attention. Ta-Nehisi Coates, there's a compilation of several of his very important essays, including the one that really helped supercharge the case for reparations in a book called We Were 8 Years in Power, that I think is not as well known as some of his other books, but is really worth the read. So a lot of education, a lot of reading. That's not enough, right? Supporting Black voices. And it's one of the reasons why the PAC that I supported, the Win the Era PAC, which is about practicing what I always preach, the presidency is not the only office that matters. We're supporting a lot of Black candidates at all kinds of different levels, from Jamie Harrison running for the U.S. Senate in South Carolina to take down Lindsey Graham. Wouldn't that be nice to retire Lindsey Graham? To Jevin Hodge, who's very new on the political scene, not that many years out of college, but is a terrific candidate running for county supervisor in Phoenix and Maricopa County, who I think is going to be with us for a generation, and a whole bunch of other. Check it out if you want, wintheera.com. You can learn about the candidates we're backing. So political support. Lending support, of course, to the movement for Black Lives and the actions that are happening out there. Policy support. I'm very proud of the Douglas Plan, the Frederick Douglass Plan, which my campaign put out. It was received as the most comprehensive plan for dealing with systemic racism that was discussed in the race. And it wasn't because I sat here and thought it up, or because I had all these great ideas. It's because Black voices really shaped that agenda using their expertise as well as their lived experience, and crafted a plan that speaks across certainly criminal justice and policing reform, but economic empowerment, health equity, education, housing, and then beneath it all, political equality, which I think is really where so much of it's going to rest. And so I mentioned that just to say that a lot of those policies, we need to be really throwing our weight behind them and not treat them as a specialty issue, because I think it's also clear that America won't make it if we let white supremacy destroy the American project. It's come very close before, as in the Civil War. And I think our generations will either live to see the American project fail because of white supremacy, or we will turn the corner on our watch. Not that we'll eradicate racism overnight, but we could be the generations that turn the corner. And after 400 years, that would really be something.
Hi, Mayor Pete. My name is Dustin Lemons, and I'm the Vice President of the College Democrats of Missouri. And my question is, what federal protections need to be granted to bring parity to the LGBTQ plus community?
Great. Thanks. And as a fellow Red State Democrat, thanks for waving the flag out there in Missouri, because I know it can be challenging. But there's no such thing as a permanently red state, right? And so we keep working and we keep winning. So look, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the decision, right? That's not the end of the road. By the way, we still need an Equality Act, right? It's still not been tested in the courts exactly which things are going to be covered by the Civil Rights Act and Title VII. We know that employment is covered, but there's so many things in terms of access to public accommodations and across the realm of health and housing and education and other areas where this is why we still need the Equality Act. So be careful if anybody says, well, we got the court decision all set, no problem, right? Those are the kinds of protections we need. We need protections to make sure that conversion therapy can't be foisted on children. We need to make sure that that there is an appropriate measure of care. We need to make sure in the military that it is not going to be the case that somebody's career will be threatened because of who they are. And I can tell you, as somebody who served overseas, it did not matter in the least whether I was gay, whether anybody else was queer in any way. That doesn't affect whether you can do your job, obviously. What does affect whether you can do your job is if you have this kind of fear of repression hanging over you, and that impacted a lot of LGBTQ plus service members. So we need to extend these kind of protections across American life, and then we also need to do our part overseas. A wonderful Egyptian LGBTQ activist lost her life in the last week to suicide, and in exile basically in Canada after being hounded out of Egypt. And so we got to get our own house in order here in the U.S., but also I think part of how the U.S. can restore some of our moral authority is to be doing a little more leadership involved on this.
Hi, Mayor Pete. Thank you for that last answer. My name is Erica Kelly. I am the president of Virginia College Democrats and the National Council Secretary.
And our question for you is, who is your greatest role model?
I don't know that I have one, but I think about kind of the different areas of life where I look up to people and what they did. One that's going to sound obvious and boring and canned, but I just have to say it because it's true, is Lincoln. And I'll tell you why. It's not just because he's on the penny and he won the Civil War and all that. While he was president, while the country was going to war against itself, he saw to it that the National Science Foundation and the Transcontinental Railroad and the land grant colleges got done. This is while the country is at war with itself, because he understood this was part of the long-term future of the country. It's actually part of national security too. And I think there's something really important about that forward thinking. He was also obsessed with making sure, and this should give us a lot to think about in this context. He was obsessed with making sure that the 1864 election took place and that it took place on time, even though he thought he would probably lose. And so that commitment to democracy is something to think about at a moment like this. So I've been on a bit of a Lincoln kick. Another early role model was Stephen Biko, who was a South African Black activist who did not get as much attention as Mandela, mostly for the reason that he was killed by police when he was still in his 20s. He was a student. He was a medical student. And he led a movement called Black Consciousness, which had a major effect at the time. And for that reason came on the radar of the police state and was arrested and eventually killed by the apartheid regime. But an early reminder of the impact that students can have, that meant a lot to me as a student, and the impact that leadership can have at a young age. So there are a couple. My literary hero right now is Hilary Mantel. If you haven't had a chance to read her books on Henry VIII, you don't have to be into Henry VIII or England or whatever. It's about, but it's psychological. It's just magnificent. Wolf Hall is the first book, and the third book just came out. And I wish I could write like that. So those are some of the role models I'm thinking about at the moment.
Hi, Mayor Pete. Thank you for being here with us. I'm Melissa Dahman, and I was the Mid-Atlantic Regional Student Lead with your campaign. And I'm wondering how the South Bend community is making it through COVID-19 and what role you are playing to support your community.
Thanks for asking, and thanks for your help with students, for Pete. So South Bend has been okay. We haven't seen the worst numbers that you're seeing in a lot of parts of the country, but we have been challenged. We have pretty good hospital resources here. The mayor, who's a close friend, I think, has done a great job of really staying ahead of the state, which was not as quick to put in the kind of protections that were needed, and that's helping. Folks are on edge here, like everywhere else. Folks are impatient here, and want to get back out there. I think we're all seeing that in communities in different ways, pricing in our families in different ways, and having those conversations. And so, obviously that's happening around here. Part of what I'm doing, not just in conversation with South Bend, but with mayors across the country, is trying to link researchers who are developing models on pandemic resilience to the community of mayors. Because like so many, other areas of American life, so many of the really important decisions are actually being made locally. Well, especially when you have a president who is providing the opposite of leadership, right? So as we've seen, it's fallen to governors and to mayors to make a lot of these decisions. One thing to consider is what it's going to be like when they actually invent a vaccine. So that's not when the problem goes away, right? You got to get it out to people. You got to make it equitable. You got to make it free, and you got to give people actually trust that they should do it. On the heels of this whole conspiratorial mindset and the anti-vax movement and a lot of things that have people skeptical or doubtful when we really need to get widespread vaccination the moment it becomes available. That's an example of something that's going to have to get worked out at the local level here in South Bend and in all the communities across the country. And I saw a wonderful presentation on what we learned from testing that should be applied then too from New Orleans, where they were included in an early round of FEMA-supported work to get testing done. But it was drive-through test centers staffed by the National Guard, which might sound like a good way to get up and running. But if you think about it, first of all, it means you have to have a car. Secondly, the first thing that you saw when you got there was people in uniform, which especially for a lot of the most vulnerable residents in New Orleans may be an intimidating sight, right? And so just rethinking how to do that, which they did, then they evolved their model, is an example of the kinds of decisions that need to be made and informed at the local level. And so whether it's in talking to friends and counterparts here in South Bend or talking to folks around the country, I'm doing my best to kind of use my relationships among the community of American mayors and connect them up to the researchers who are coming up with models for testing and tracing and supported isolation and eventually vaccine distribution. Try to make sure that all of that gets linked up because, this is, even if we had a great president, this would be a challenge locally, but with the disaster of a president that we have, it's really falling on the locals to do so much of the work.
Thank you. My name is Julia Larkin, and I'm the Deputy Programs Director for CDA. First, I just want to thank you for your service in our military, but we were also wondering what was the most important lesson that you brought back from your experience in the military?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about trust. We don't have a lot of trust. Americans don't have a lot of trust in government or in each other right now. High trust nations tend to have better outcomes on everything from public health, right? Vaccines, again, stuff like that, to the willingness to use taxes to deliver, good social policy. Everyone likes Scandinavia, right? Especially us Democrats. One of the things that characterizes Scandinavia is a hugely high level of social trust. Even in our own history, moments where we had a lot of progressive legislation, the New Deal moments, or even the 60s, that we had a higher level of trust societally than we do now. So the reason I'm thinking of that is I'm thinking about the experience of being in a vehicle the first time I went outside the wire with somebody I barely knew, and we're trusting our lives to each other. And we may be from a different background, different racially, definitely different politically. A lot of people I serve with, but you learn to trust each other with your life. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the ways, since military service is not for everybody and not everybody should have to go to war, how do you make sure more people have that experience? And I can think of at least two things that will help. One is national service. I'm a big fan of creating way more opportunities for voluntary civilian national service, because that means more people have that experience of working together. The other is one of the reasons I think quality public schools are so important, because they become a touchstone, a shared experience that people of very different backgrounds have, and then as they go into very different lives can kind of come back to. And so again, racially, economically, societally, if we have excellent public schools that people from all walks of life want to go to, then that could be an instrument of social cohesion. Of course, now it's often the reverse. It's an instrument of division, because there are so many communities where people of means don't view public schools as where they're going to send their kids. So that whole set of thoughts about trust, that's probably the biggest thing that I took away. I mean, I can point to all kinds of individual, like national security things, especially about alliances, right? I mean, I depended on especially working with British, but just a lot of allies that we've been pissing off lately, that we, that's going to be a problem in a future engagement. But outside like specific national security stuff, it's really that question of how we come to trust fellow Americans that I came to think of in a whole new way after serving.
Hey, Mayor Pete. My name is Keith Nagy. I am the former president of College Democrats at George Washington University. And my question for you is, what do you believe your team did differently than others to pull ahead in the Iowa caucuses?
Thanks. A lot of Nagy's around South Bend. I don't know if you got any relatives out here. Okay.
My dad.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. All right. Wait, which Nagy's your dad?
Oh, David Nagy.
Okay. I'll get the family tree later.
Yeah.
There's one guy in South, this is a total aside, there's a guy in South Bend, Randy Sheevish, who's a candidate for local office. To give you a sense of some of the ethnic backgrounds here, there's not one vowel in his entire name. It's PRSVYBY, as is part of that same Eastern European tradition that's part of our history. Anyway, what was your question? Okay, I'm sorry. So look, I'm really proud of the innovative tactics that our campaign adopted, especially in terms of how people can reach each other, because I think some of them are very relevant now to pandemic campaigning. So one thing we're really big on is relational organizing. Those of you who might have been involved in the campaign probably heard a lot from our organizers about this. Is the idea that the most powerful thing in political communication is to hear from somebody you already know. And so inviting and enlisting supporters to like create kind of rosters of the people in their lives that they could reach out to, and then twinning that with apps on the campaign that could help systematize that. I don't think we're the only people with this approach, but I think the way we did it was phenomenal, and I think it was a big part of our success. So that was one. Another was that, you know, we didn't look, nobody heard of me when we got in, right? So we had to build a lot of things from the ground up, and we had a lot of online excitement before we had any kind of staff or organization or money. And we knew we had to capitalize on that. So we had a program of digital captains. And basically what it is, we found people who seemed online to be really supportive and enlisted them in a more formal way, and then gave them a toolkit to reach out to others. And I think that served us well, and I've been pleased to see that approach picked up in a lot of ways by other campaigns now. And then another thing is less a tactical thing, but more a style thing. I thought it was really important to try to reach everybody and to never assume that somebody wouldn't hear our message just because they were conservative. And so in Iowa, I never pretended to be more conservative than I am. And yet I found often people would come up to me after the speech and they'd say, you know, I've always been a Republican, but I'm going to support you. And part of me is like, did you see the speech? Because like, you got some pretty strong progressive ideas in here. But there was a way of reaching people as people that helps them, I think, to let go of some of their more tribal or partisan identities and try to find that humanity in people. I think really served us well. Again, we weren't tricking them. We were very clear about what my policies were. But we found that a ton of people, especially in those counties in Iowa that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, were some of our best counties. And so I think that's how we were able to get that win in Iowa. It would have been nice to hear that on the day of instead of a few days or weeks later. But that brings me to an important point, by the way. We do need to prepare for not getting election results right away in November. And we can't allow that to be used to undermine the credibility of the elections themselves. It's just going to happen. I mean, if there's a lot of vote by mail, some states aren't even allowed to touch the vote by mail ballots until after polls close. It's going to take some time. And we're used to, you know, AP calling an election 2 minutes after polls close in some states. It's not going to be like that. And that's okay. So we got to figure out a way to prepare. And I'm just planting that seed now. I know there's a lot we got to get through between now and November, but I think about it whenever I think about the experience of waiting for reasons that I would consider to be not okay for a very long time to get the final counts in Iowa.
Hi, Mayor Pete. My name is Brooke Fisher. I was the social media director for American University Students for Pete. And I'm very eager to know your answer to this question. Do you identify more as a buddy or a Truman, and why?
Oh, good question. I would say that Truman is probably more my vibe. He's a little more, he kind of is a little more mellow, kind of takes it all in. He'll bark, but not quite as often. Buddy, he's got to be right up next to you. You got to know that Buddy's there. Obviously, I love them both. I love them equally. But these are our dogs, by the way, if you're not as close to a follower of our campaign. But yeah, I would say, although interestingly, Buddy's the one who seems to take to me more. So I don't know what that tells you. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Mayor Buttigieg. My name is Brooks Fordham, and as I said earlier, I am the LGBTQ caucus chair for College Democrats of America. And my question to you is, what should Vice President Biden do to unify the Democratic Party?
Great question. Well, I think a lot of it's listening, and I've seen that. You know, you look at the groups that he's put together on policy, incorporating everybody from alumni in my campaign to alumni of Bernie's campaign and various others. I think that's a really important part of the process. I think a second thing is, and again, I believe he's doing it, is to not just rely on what we're against. Like we all know what we're up against, right? We know what an unbelievable disaster it would be for this president to get reelected. But that's actually not quite enough. I mean, it's motivation enough for me, but people have to know what it's about, what you're for, right? One of the reasons I decided to endorse him almost right away after closing out my campaign was that he's talked a lot about he talks about the soul of the nation, right? It's a different vocabulary than I use, but it's a similar idea to what motivated my campaign, talking a lot about belonging and a lot about questions of who we are and what leadership brings out of us. So yeah, policy. I'm a policy guy. We talk about policy a lot, but beyond policy, right? That question of kind of who we're going to be as a country, and why it matters who the president is in terms of what kind of country we're going to become, and whether we have the best or the worst things called out of us. I would argue that Trump doesn't only bring out the worst in his supporters. I would argue that sometimes he has ways of bringing out the worst in all of us. It just shortens our attention span, and I don't feel like my best self when I'm watching it. And so I think it's going to be very important to continue to develop a story about what we could have. And then the other thing that I think is really important is just including a lot of generationally varied voices in the campaign, and hopefully in the government and the administration to come. And again, he's indicated his commitment to doing that, and it's one of the reasons I'm really excited to back him. But the leaders can only do so much. I mean, even Bernie can only do so much to ask his supporters to jump in, right? And in the end, a lot of it's going to be more peer-to-peer. It's going to be the stuff that you all can do as activists in the college space to appeal, again, not just like the other guy sucks, even though that's true, but like, here's what we could be building together. And the way I would try to unify the party around this, or the way I would invite you to try, with your friends and see how it goes, is to think of it this way. During the primary, we had a lot of debates over exactly how to do certain things, exactly how to get everybody health care, exactly how to raise wages, exactly how to get this country carbon neutral by mid-century and beat climate change. And when we win, we'll be able to have those debates again, right? If we manage to get the Senate and keep the House and take the White House, then of course we will be debating as a country, but also leaders in our party will be debating exactly how to do these things. Exactly how to deliver racial justice, exactly how to have science-led policy that works on future pandemics. But between now and then, between the primary that's over and the government that doesn't exist yet, is this season. And this season is going to settle the question of whether, not how, right? It's whether we're going to do something about climate change, or whether we're going to have a president who says it's a hoax. It's whether we're going to demonstrate this is a country that sees the Black Lives Matter, or whether we're going to have a president who denies that systemic racism even exists. It's whether we're going to raise wages and empower workers or not, right? And we're all on the same side of whether to do those things. Then, when we settle that question as a country, we can go right back to that tug of war over how. But that tug of war over how is a luxury that we will earn if and only we win and settle the question of whether.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pete, for answering all of our questions. That was so inspiring, and I definitely know which books I'm going to read next, so that's exciting.
I'm going to get in so much trouble. Book by a queer author everybody should read. Chasten has a book coming out in September. Can't believe I didn't lead with that. I'm glad I caught that just in time. It's called I Have Something to Tell You. Coming out in September. You should totally read it. It's going to be great. Whew. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Do you have any last words that you'd like to leave with College Dems?
Just thank you. I mean, first of all, thanks so much to each of you who were involved in my campaign, and no matter who you were for in the primary, thanks for what you're doing as college Democrats. So don't ever feel like you're a sort of like appendage to the party. You are the beating heart of the party right now in so many ways, and the conversations that are happening among young people and the reach that you have, especially because again, this is same vocabulary, different issue. We're talking about how versus whether. The younger somebody is, the more they're thinking not about how to vote, but whether to vote. So you can play a huge role in making sure that goes right. And if it happens, I'm really convinced, as bleak as things look sometimes, this could be the beginning of a period we remember as the turning point toward a dramatically better life in this country. You can do that. And it's going to be hard. I mean, it was hard to begin with, and it's super hard now because we're isolated and we've got the pandemic going on, and there's so many challenges. And by the way, be ready for a couple more. These things don't usually come in ones and twos. If I were an enemy of the United States, state or non-state, I'd be picking this late summer to do something big. So be ready for a few more punches that we got to roll with. Stay strong, support each other, be that social glue that holds the party and campaigns together. And then we're going to have a lot to celebrate, but only for a minute, because then the real work's going to begin. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm so thankful for what you do. I hope you stay strong and stay motivated and get all your friends and peers motivated too. And I can't wait till I do get to see you in person, travel the country again, and campaign for people we both believe in.
Thank you so much, Mayor Pete, and thank you so much to all the college Dems that joined us today. If you're interested, we will be having a call tomorrow with Attorney Generals Maura Healey and Dana Nessel at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to continue our Pride series. But thank you so much, Mayor Pete.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.